Welcome back for the third mini lecture on German history. In the last mini lecture, I ended with the attempt of the Austrians, the Catholic German state that tried to unify the German peoples under the banner of Catholicism. That, of course, disintegrated, and we ended up instead with the 30 Years' War. And today I want to talk about another attempt at unification with the rise of Prussia that's discussed in your textbook. Uh, the Prussians were a northern German state, a Protestant state where Berlin is its capital. Even though this state was powerful a bit earlier than this, uh, its rise really is associated with the 30 Years' War, and especially in the century after the 30 Years' War. Roskin features Frederick the Great. Roskin leaves out some details that I included in the notes that I think would have added to the discussion. For example, during the 7 Years' War, Frederick the Great seized Silesia, which became very important for natural resources, coal and steel in particular. He also annexed Poland during that same 7 Years' War. By the turn of the 19th century, by 1800, there is no question that Prussia was by far the strongest of the German states, although they got a very rude wake-up call. Prussia was the strongest of the German states, but then they found out that the French, especially the French under Napoleon, were a much more formidable military. The French had a much abler bureaucracy, and they were able to extract resources much more efficiently than were the Prussians. And so I talked earlier when I was talking about France, you may remember in those mini lectures that Napoleon is significant not just as a French figure, but as a European figure. He brings a wave of nationalism to the continent. He brings nationalism to the more than 300 German states. We also get nationalism a couple decades after Napoleon with the creation of an independent Belgium. And we also later in the 19th century get the creation of an independent Greece. The former five Italian states unify into a unified Italy in the 19th century. And of course, later in the 19th century, the most important of the nationalistic movements is going to be the formation of a unified German state after the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. Prussia and Austria had this rivalry, and even though Prussia was the strongest German state and Austria was the second strongest state, the fact was that Napoleon came in and was able to defeat both of them. And the fairly easy defeat of the Prussians by Napoleon in 1806 was rather shocking and certainly revealed to the German states that we were in need of modernization, not just militarily, but bureaucratically, governmentally. We needed a more efficient tax structure and a whole variety of things. Napoleon also consolidated the German states. Instead of over 300 relatively small states, if I ask you on the exam, Napoleon consolidated the German states into 39 political entities. And after Napoleon was defeated in 1815 at the peace treaty, the Congress of Vienna, the 39 German states formed a confederation. And if that sounds familiar, keep in mind that in the United States, we see another parallel to Germany in our history. Our first constitution in the United States was called the Articles of Confederation. The Confederation was really too weak to govern effectively, and we quickly replaced the Articles of Confederation with our current Constitution. In the German states, the Confederation lasted a bit longer, lasted for approximately 4 decades. And the defeat by Napoleon created two very distinct reactions in the German states. The reaction that is emphasized by Ruskin in the chapter is that of the creation of the Austrian prince Metternich. Metternich was a reactionary prince who tried to restore pre-Napoleonic European monarchy stability. He was an authoritarian. He wanted a stronger executive. And once again, you see this split that we've seen earlier in France, where it is the conservatives who want to concentrate executive power in either a strong king, a strong prince, a military strongman, or later, in the case of someone like de Gaulle, a strong president. So Metternich was a reactionary, was a conservative who was stressing executive power, stability, order, and the things that you usually see conservatives emphasizing. The liberals, and your book briefly mentions the emergence of German liberalism. In 1848, there was an assembly to discuss potential political reform and a unified German state. Ruskin doesn't mention this, so I'll add it to the discussion. The leftists at the assembly really saw the British political system as their model. The liberals wanted to create a state based on the British model with a constitutional monarch. So they wanted to vest political power in a legislature modeled after the British House of Commons. They were hoping for a prime minister to head that. So you have liberals wanting a British-based system with the monarch as a chief of state, but not a chief executive. And of course, the conservatives wanted a king with real formidable powers. And so the assembly broke up. There was no resolution to this, and Germany remained fragmented until we see Prussia finally become the unifier. And so if you look under Roman numeral 3, the unification of Germany and the Second Reich from 1871 to 1918. So the First Reich was the Holy Roman Empire, which lasted from 800 technically till 1806, but really the First Reich was a system more on paper than in practice. In reality, the various political entities vested power, not the emperor. Germany, the modern Germany that we see after the Franco-Prussian War, was not forged by democracy. Instead, it was the product of military force. The creation of Germany was top-down, orchestrated by authoritarian political elites. Of course, the unifier was Prussia and their foreign minister, Otto von Bismarck, who I think Ruskin misrepresents a bit, and I'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. The principal aim of Bismarck was to galvanize a unified German state under Prussian leadership. A lot of people, in my opinion, characterize Bismarck as kind of the pre-Hitler. Nothing could be farther from the truth. Bismarck was a nationalist. Hitler was an internationalist. Bismarck had very limited aims and ambitions. Hitler had worldwide territorial ambition, and you could go on and on. As a nationalist, what Bismarck was most interested in was in the creation of Germany as a great power. Bismarck wanted to see a German state that could compete with the British and the French on the world stage, although he did not want and did not believe it was in Germany's national interest to create an oversized empire. So when I say that he wanted to compete with the British and the French on the world stage, I do not mean in the acquisition of colonies. In fact, he said that that would be a bad thing, that if Germany was to attempt to have an overseas empire, it would require the acquisition of a large navy that would draw the wrath of both the British and the French. And Bismarck said that the country should maintain peaceful relations uh, with Britain, because the one area where Bismarck was a bit confrontational was he did see the French as a potential rival over time. I would also say that Bismarck wanted to preserve the feudal social order. He wanted to ensure the triumph of Prussia over Austria for the preeminence of Germany. And Bismarck did this through limited warfare. You should know for exam purposes that Bismarck engaged in limited warfare against Denmark in 1864, where Prussia took Schleswig and Holstein, which is a German state even today. Uh, Prussia won this war rather easily, defeated Austria fairly easily 2 years later in 1866, and most importantly, defeated the French in the Franco-Prussian War. This was an overwhelming defeat for Prussia. Uh, Roskin does not discuss this, but keep in mind the statistic that I gave you earlier. There were 187,000 deaths in the Franco-Prussian War, and 140,000 of the 187,000 deaths were French. So the Prussians win this war. They take this region called the Alsace and Lorraine. As I mentioned in the notes, a complaint that I have with Roskin, and please read it for yourself on page 135, is where he has a box entitled Bismarck's Dubious Legacy. I do agree with Roskin that Bismarck was an authoritarian and his leadership retarded the development of democratic institutions. I think he's correct. However, the implications are that Bismarck is a toned down Hitler, and that's not true. He did not want to control all of Europe. He did want to isolate the French, and Roskin doesn't mention that. That was the chief goal of his foreign policy. But he stressed a very conservative foreign policy. He said that we should not have any overseas colonies. We should have a very limited navy, that we should stay divorced from Austrian ambitions in Europe, especially in Eastern Europe, etc. If there is one mistake that Bismarck made, was that he destroyed the flexible alliance system that had been the hallmark of international relations from the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 up through the end of the Napoleonic Wars. The notion was that all of the other European powers were legitimate alliance partners, and that the primary goal of the international system should not be to avoid wars. There were lots of wars, but that the war should be limited, that none of the great powers should be destroyed, and that in the future you readmit the defeated country back into the great power club, where they might be a valuable ally in the future. Look at the Napoleonic Wars. The Napoleonic Wars were ended by what was called the Quadruple Alliance. Quadruple, four great powers. In other words, Napoleon tried to destroy the international system. He wanted to dominate Europe. The result was all the other great powers in Europe allied, even though some of them didn't like one another, in order to defeat Napoleon. When the war was over, France was readmitted to the great power club. Napoleon was punished, but France was readmitted as a great power because they might be a power that would be needed if another country like Russia or England or Austria or Prussia tried to take over the system. I'll continue with the Second Reich later.